This is chapter 4 of Jerry A. Coyne's book, Why Evolution is True, entitled Geography of Life. Chapter 4 begins with Coyne retelling the story of a man named Alexander Selkirk. He was a Scottish sailor who set seas in the Cinque Ports in 1703. Worried with the conditions of the crew and of the boat, he was asked to be led ashore, so he was marooned on an island 400 miles west of Chile, and what is now known as the Juan Fernandez Island. He would spend the next couple of years surviving off of the island until finally being picked up by a British ship. He was returned back to London, where he would start to retell his stories. It is said that his stories were the inspiration of Robinson Crusoe. Juan Fernandez Island has since then become a tourism destination where patrons can now look and observe different kinds of plants and animals that have grown endemically only there, such as the ugni or the famous San Juan firecrow bird, as pictured here. Endemic, of course, is anything that grows or exists in only a certain place. This chapter also starts to ask the questions why almost all of Australia's mammals are marsupials, when generally speaking, the world over has placental mammals. It also asks why the flora and the fauna of southern Africa so closely resemble South America. These were all questions asked, of course, by Coyne, the author of this book, but also Charles Darwin back on his travels with the beagle, as he would see the correlation between the finches on the archipelago and on the Chilean coast. These we'll go into in further detail. The quickest way to answer why there are similar organisms on South America, just as there are in parts of Africa, would be plate tectonics and continental drift. As pictured below, at one point all land masses were held together by a supercontinent we have called Pangaea, but after millions of years, the continents have drifted apart, and we have what we have now. Charles Darwin, of course, never had the information that we have now of continental drift and plate tectonics, but it all but solidifies his hypothesis that at some point there was divergence in the species. Here we see that there's a physical divergence, quite literally with the continents drifting apart, but it does solve the issue as to why there are similar organisms in vastly different areas of the world. Another tool that we have nowadays that Charles Darwin never had back then was the technology of the molecular clock. This is a device or a type of bioanalysis that, starting in the 1960s, allowed scientists to observe how species would start to differentiate, and how it also gave a relatively good timetable as to when mutations occurred in certain species. It allowed scientists to piece together different family trees to see which organisms were most related to one another. Coyne continues the debate between creationists by stating how different organisms have similar families but are completely different. One of the cases he gives us are succulents and euphorbs. Succulents are something native to North and South America, whereas euphorbs are strictly native to Asia, Australia, and Africa. We see that they are similar in shape and size. The most obvious thing you'll notice here is that succulents and euphorbias show convergence. Now, convergent evolution is the independent evolution of similar features and species of different lineages. Just in this case, we see that succulents and euphorbias are different lineages, but they will show similar traits in that their leaves are waxy, they have a tolerance to very dry climate, they show common ancestry. As explained by continental drift, we saw that at one point they were living in the same area, but as the continents started to drift apart, you will see that they started to evolve separately. They had speciation, Given the two different environments, they adapted in very similar ways, but in very distinct ways. And of course, we have natural selection. Given their situation, both organisms had to evolve and adapt to the dry climates.
Knowing that the earliest marsupials are found in North America, not Australia, we pose the question, how can marsupials cross the South Atlantic? Before South America and Australia became their own continents, they comprised the southern supercontinent Gondwana, along with Antarctica. South America was connected to Antarctica, and Antarctica was connected to Australia. Scientists believe that when the continents were still together as Gondwana, the marsupials passed from North America to Australia through Antarctica. Based off of this hypothesis, scientists made the prediction that there were marsupial fossils in Antarctica that were about 30 to 40 million years old. And after making the trip to Antarctica, that was exactly what they found. And they were the right age. 35 to 40 million years old. But what about similar, not identical species that live in similar habitats but on different continents? Had all the continents always been in their current locations, it would be really difficult to explain. We know today that dispersal occurred through the existence of ancient land connections between continents. Dispersal of organisms and successful colonization resulted in evolution. Because of this, it would be safe to make the prediction that species living in one area should be the descendants of earlier species that lived in the same place. If you were to find fossils in a relatively shallow area, the fossils should resemble organisms that are found today. Concluding that extinct apes, being humans' nearest allies, resided in Africa, Charles Darwin made the prediction that the earliest humans lived in Africa. It wasn't until 1924 when remains of these early humans were found where Darwin had predicted. Biogeography has helped answer many questions and solve puzzles, including the movement of glaciers and fossil trees. As glaciers move, the rocks and pebbles underneath them create scratches along the underlying rock, indicating the direction of their movement. Glaciation of southern continents and subcontinents occurred during the Permian period, which was about 290 million years ago. When comparing the movement of glaciers across different continents, there seem to be strange glacial patterns. The glaciers appear to be arising in warm areas and moving from seas onto continents. When tracing where the glaciers started and ended on each continent, it seems really arbitrary and inconsistent. To help analyze the glaciation patterns, we can also look at the fossil trees Glossopteris. During the Permian period, Glossopteris were the more prominent trees, and there was evidence to believe that these trees were deciduous, meaning that they lost their leaves in the fall season and regrew them in the spring. This would lead to the idea that Glossopteris lived in temperate areas with cold winters. Like the glaciers, they too had strange patterns of movement. It was really unlikely that these trees would have dispersed overseas because the seeds were too heavy to float. Glacial and fossil tree patterns made sense when they were compared to the location of the continents on Gondwana. The patterns show that they are moving away from the center of Antarctica, and it showed the plausible direction in which both the glaciers and the Glossopteris had moved. And it was concluded that it was the continents themselves that had moved, not the trees. Before we continue to explain evolution, we need to recognize that there are two different types of islands, first of which are continental islands. They are the islands that were once connected to a continent but were later separated either by rising sea levels that flooded former land bridges or by moving continental plates. These include the British Isles, Japan, Sri Lanka, Tasmania, and Madagascar. The second kind is oceanic islands. They are islands that were never connected to a continent. They arose from the sea floor as growing volcanoes or coral reefs. Examples of these are the Hawaiian Islands, the Galapagos Archipelago, and St. Helena. Aside from how each of these types of islands came about, they differ in their native species. Oceanic islands lack many species that are found on continents and continental islands. For example, Hawaii has plants, birds, insects, amphibians, but lacks fresh and land animals. This is a common pattern between most oceanic islands where they are pretty much missing the same groups of organisms. One of the speculations was that maybe non-native species don't do as well in those habitats. But on the contrary, non-native species actually do really well and end up taking over and wiping out the native species. Non-native species brought by humans to oceanic islands displace or destroy native forms by feeding on the native organisms and disturbing the current ecological systems. Despite lacking many groups of animals that are commonly found on continents and continental islands, there are animals on oceanic islands that have experienced radiation, meaning they are comprised of many different species. An example of this is the radiation of birds. The Galapagos is famous for their finches. There are 28 endemic species, meaning they are not found anywhere else. These species include the woodpecker finch, who uses cactus, spines, or twigs to pry insects from trees, similar to woodpeckers, which are not found on the Galapagos, and there are also vampire finches who peck on the rear ends of seabirds and consume their blood. The Hawaiian Islands also have a great radiation of birds. When the Polynesians arrived in Hawaii, there were about 140 species of native birds. Of these 140 species, 60 of these species were honey creepers. Today, only 20 of those species of honey creepers exist, and they are all endangered. Radiation in the oceanic islands also occurs in plants and insects as well. Even though St. Helena lacks many groups of insects, they are home to many small, flightless beetles, including wood weevils, and despite taking up a minuscule amount of the Earth's land, Hawaii is home to about 2,000 species of the fruit fly, Drosophila. St. Helena also contains plants in the sunflower family that have grown to become small woody trees, and in general, the small flowering plants lack competition from larger trees and other plants, and because of this, they have evolved to actual trees. The table on this slide lists the groups of organisms that are native to the oceanic islands and those that are missing from it. But what's the difference between these two columns? The native species have the ability to colonize on oceanic islands through long-distance dispersal. Birds can fly long distances to establish colonization. They can also bring seeds from different plants through their droppings, and insects can cling onto their feathers as they travel. Many plants and animals have hitched rides from logs or masses of vegetation that float away from the continents. The organisms that are missing, however, lack that ability to colonize through long-distance dispersal. Most land mammals and reptiles can't fly, and they are too heavy and can't swim far enough to reach oceanic islands. Also, most amphibians and freshwater fish cannot survive in salt water. Even though oceanic islands lack many of the mammals that are common on continents and continental islands, they do not lack all mammals. Terrestrial mammals aren't found on oceanic islands, but aerial mammals like bats are found in almost all of them. Unlike terrestrial mammals, bats have the ability to fly long distances just like birds do. Although long-distance dispersal is possible and is a plausible explanation for the differences in species between continental and oceanic islands, it is most likely not a common occurrence. The chances of a long-distance colonization is very low, but over the course of millions of years, it is bound to happen.
As alluded to before, you'll see that the finches that Darwin observed on the archipelago closely resembled those that appear on the mainland. We noticed this in many of the islands, almost very similarly to the Hawaiian Islands. They show similar species to their neighbors in the mainland of the Indo-Pacific countries. We also see that Madagascar, an African landmass that separated almost 250 million years ago, show very distinct yet very similar organisms to those of mainland Africa, right off of the east side. Coyne goes on to explain how the islands have a very fragile existence. The ecosystems and the animals that live there have a very low tolerance to invaders. Foreign invaders like new plants or animals or even humans are the largest cause of extinction in small ecosystems.